Chapter 15 of Tales of Troy, Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maggie Travers. Tales of Troy, Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities by Andrew Lang. Chapter 15. How Ulysses invented the device of the horse of tree, and the end of Troy and the saving of Helen. After Paris died, Helen was not given back to Menelaus. We are often told that only fear of the anger of Paris had prevented the Trojans from surrendering Helen and making peace. Now Paris could not terrify them, yet for all that the men of the town would not part with Helen, whether because she was so beautiful, or because they thought it dishonorable to yield her to the Greeks, who might put her to a cruel death. So Helen was taken by Deiphobus, the brother of Paris, to live in his own house, and Deiphobus was at this time the best warrior and the chief captain of the men of Troy. Meanwhile the Greeks made an assault against the Trojan walls and fought long and heartily. But, being safe behind the battlements, and shooting through loopholes, the Trojans drove them back with the loss of many of their men. It was not in vain that Philoctetes shot his poisoned arrows. They fell back from the stone walls, or stuck in the palisades of wood above the walls, and the Greeks who tried to climb over were speared, or crushed with heavy stones. When night fell, they retreated to the ships, and held a council. And, as usual, they asked the advice of the prophet Calchas. It was the business of Calchas to go about looking at birds and taking omens from what he saw them doing, a way of prophesying which the Romans also used, and some savages do the same to this day. Calchas said that yesterday he had seen a hawk pursuing a dove, which hid herself in a hole in a rocky cliff. For a long while the hawk tried to find the hole, and follow the dove into it, but he could not reach her. So he flew away for a short distance and hid himself. Then the dove fluttered out into the sunlight, and the hawk swooped on her and killed her. "The Greeks," said Calchas, "ought to learn a lesson from the hawk and take Troy by cunning, as by force they could do nothing." Then Ulysses stood up and described a trick which it is not easy to understand. "The Greeks," he said, "ought to make an enormous hollow horse of wood, and place the bravest men in the horse. Then all the rest of the Greeks should embark in their ships and sail to the Isle of Tenedos, and lie hidden behind the island. The Trojans would then come out of the city, like the dove out of her hole in the rock, and would wander about the Greek camp, and wonder why the great horse of tree had been made, and why it had been left behind. Lest they should set fire to the horse, when they would soon have found out the warriors hidden in it, a cunning Greek, whom the Trojans did not know by sight, should be left in the camp or near it. He would tell the Trojans that the Greeks had given up all hope and gone home, and he was to say that they feared the goddess Pallas was angry with them, because they had stolen her image that fell from heaven, and was called the Luck of Troy. To soothe Pallas and prevent her from sending great storms against the ships, the Trojans, so the man was to say, had built this wooden horse as an offering to the goddess. The Trojans, believing this story, would drag the horse into Troy, and, in the night, the princes would come out, set fire to the city, and open the gates to the army, which would return from Tenedos as soon as darkness came on. The prophet was much pleased with the plan of Ulysses, and, as two birds happened to fly away on the right hand, he declared that the stratagem would certainly be lucky. Neoptolemus, on the other hand, voted for taking Troy, without any trick, by sheer hard fighting. Ulysses replied that if Achilles could not do that, it could not be done at all, and that Epeius, a famous carpenter, had better set about making the horse at once. Next day half the army, with axes in their hands, were sent to cut down trees on Mount Ida, and thousands of planks were cut from the trees by Epeius and his workmen, and in 3 days he had finished the horse. Ulysses then asked the best of the Greeks to come forward and go inside the machine, while one, whom the Greeks did not know by sight, should volunteer to stay behind in the camp and deceive the Trojans. Then a young man called Sinon stood up and said that he would risk himself and take the chance that the Trojans might disbelieve him and burn him alive. Certainly, none of the Greeks did anything more courageous, yet Sinon had not been considered brave. Had he fought in the front ranks, the Trojans would have known him. But there were many brave fighters who would not have dared to do what Sinon undertook. Then old Nestor was the first that volunteered to go into the horse, but Neoptolemus said that, brave as he was too old, and that he must depart with the army to Tenedos. Neoptolemus himself would go into the horse, for he would rather die than turn his back on Troy. So Neoptolemus armed himself and climbed into the horse, as did Menelaus, Ulysses, Diomed, Thrasymedes, Nestor's son, Idomeneus, Philocides, Meronius, and all the best men except Agamemnon, while Epeius himself entered last of all. Agamemnon was not allowed by the other Greeks to share their adventure, as he was to command the army when they returned from Tenedos. They meanwhile launched their ships and sailed away. But first Menelaus had led Ulysses apart, and told him that if they took Troy, and now they must either take it or die at the hands of the Trojans, he would owe to Ulysses the glory. When they came back to Greece, he wished to give Ulysses one of his own cities, that they might always be near each other. Ulysses smiled and shook his head. He could not leave Ithaca, his own rough island kingdom. "But if we both live through the night that is coming," he said, "I may ask you for one gift, and giving it will make you none the poorer." Then Menelaus swore by the splendor of Zeus that Ulysses could ask him for no gift that he would not gladly give. So they embraced, and both armed themselves and went up into the horse. With them were all the chiefs except Nestor, whom they would not allow to come, and Agamemnon, who, as chief general, had to command the army. They swathed themselves and their arms in soft silks, that they might not ring and clash when the Trojans, if they were so foolish, dragged the horse up into their town, and there they sat in the dark, waiting. Meanwhile the army burned their huts and launched their ships, and with oars and sails made their way to the back of the Isle of Tenedos. The end of Troy and the saving of Helen. From the walls the Trojans saw the black smoke go up thick into the sky, and the whole fleet of the Greeks sailing out to sea. Never were men so glad, and they armed themselves for fear of an ambush, and went cautiously, sending forth scouts in front of them, down to the seashore. Here they found the huts burned down and the camp deserted, and some of the scouts also caught Sinon, who had hid himself in a place where he was likely to be found. They rushed on him with fierce cries, and bound his hands with a rope, and kicked and dragged him along to the place where Priam and the princes were wondering at the great horse of tree. Sinon looked round upon them, while some were saying that he ought to be tortured with fire to make him tell all the truth about the horse. The chiefs in the horse must have trembled for fear lest torture should wring the truth out of Sinon, for then the Trojans would simply burn the machine and them within it. But Sinon said, "Miserable man that I am, whom the Greeks hate and the Trojans are eager to slay!" When the Trojans heard that the Greeks hated him, they were curious and asked who he was and how he came to be there. "I will tell you all, O king," he answered Priam. "I was a friend and squire of an unhappy chief, Palamedes, whom the wicked Ulysses hated and slew secretly one day when he found him alone, fishing in the sea. I was angry, and in my folly I did not hide my anger, and my words came to the ears of Ulysses. From that hour he sought occasion to slay me. Then Calchas—" Here he stopped, saying, "But why tell a long tale? If you hate all Greeks alike, then slay me. This is what Agamemnon and Ulysses desired. Menelaus would thank you for my head." The Trojans were now more curious than before. They bade him go on, and he said that the Greeks had consulted an oracle which advised them to sacrifice one of their army to appease the anger of the gods and gain a fair wind homewards. But who was to be sacrificed? They asked Calchas, who for 15 days refused to speak. At last, being bribed by Ulysses, he pointed to me, Sinon, and said that I must be the victim. I was bound and kept in prison, while they built their great horse as a present for Pallas Athene, the goddess. They made it so large that you Trojans might never be able to drag it into your city, while, if you destroyed it, the goddess might turn her anger against you. And now they have gone home to bring back the image that fell from heaven, which they had sent to Greece, and to restore it to the temple of Pallas Athene, when they have taken your town, for the goddess is angry with them for that theft of Ulysses." The Trojans were foolish enough to believe the story of Sinon, and they pitied him and unbound his hands. Then they tied ropes to the wooden horse and laid rollers in front of it, like men launching a ship, and they all took turns to drag the horse up to the Scaean gate. Children and women put their hands to the ropes and hauled, and with shouts and dances and hymns they toiled, till about nightfall the horse stood in the courtyard of the inmost castle. Then all the people of Troy began to dance and drink and sing. Such sentinels as were set at the gates got as drunk as all the rest, who danced about the city till after midnight, and then they went to their homes and slept heavily. Meanwhile the Greek ships were returning from behind Tenedos as fast as the oarsmen could row them. One Trojan did not drink or sleep. This was Deiphobus, at whose house Helen was now living. He bade her come with them, for he knew that she was able to speak in the very voice of all men and women whom she had ever seen, and he armed a few of his friends and went with them to the citadel. Then he stood beside the horse, holding Helen's hand, and whispered to her that she must call each of the chiefs in the voice of his wife. She was obliged to obey, and she called Menelaus in her own voice, and Diomed in the voice of his wife, and Ulysses in the very voice of Penelope. Then Menelaus and Diomed were eager to answer, but Ulysses grasped their hands and whispered the word, "Echo!" Then they remembered that this was a name of Helen, because she could speak in all voices, and they were silent. But Anticlus was still eager to answer, till Ulysses held his strong hand over his mouth. There was only silence, and Deiphobus led Helen back to his house. When they had gone away, Epus opened the side of the horse, and all the chiefs let themselves down softly to the ground. Some rushed to the gate to open it, and they killed the sleeping sentinels and let in the Greeks. Others sped with torches to burn the houses of the Trojan princes, and terrible was the slaughter of men, unarmed and half awake, and loud were the cries of the women. But Ulysses had slipped away at the first, none knew where. Neoptolemus ran to the palace of Priam, who was sitting at the altar in his courtyard, praying vainly to the gods, for Neoptolemus slew the old man cruelly, and his white hair was dabbled in his blood. All through the city was fighting and slaying, but Menelaus went to the house of Deiphobus, knowing that Helen was there. In the doorway he found Deiphobus, lying dead in all his armor, a spear standing in his breast. There were footprints marked in blood, leading through the portico and into the hall. There Menelaus went and found Ulysses leaning, wounded, against one of the central pillars of the great chamber, the firelight shining on his armor. "Why hast thou slain Deiphobus and robbed me of my revenge?" said Menelaus. "You swore to me a gift," said Ulysses, "and will you keep your oath?" "Ask what you will," said Menelaus. "It is yours, and my oath cannot be broken." "I ask the life of Helen of the fair hands," said Ulysses. "This is my own life price that I pay back to her, for she saved my life when I took the Luck of Troy, and I swore that hers should be saved." Then Helen stole, glimmering in white robes, from a recess in the dark hall, and fell at the feet of Menelaus. Her golden hair lay in the dust of the hearth, and her hands moved to touch his knees. His drawn sword fell from the hands of Menelaus, and pity and love came into his heart, and he raised her from the dust, and her white arms were round his neck, and they both wept. That night Menelaus fought no more, but they tended the wound of Ulysses, for the sword of Deiphobus had bitten through his helmet. When dawn came, Troy lay in ashes, and the women were being driven with spear shafts to the ships, and the men were left unburied, a prey to dogs and all manner of birds. Thus the great city fell, that had lorded it for many centuries. All the gold and silver and rich embroideries, and ivory and amber, the horses and chariots, were divided among the army. All but a treasure of silver and gold, hidden in a chest within a hollow of the wall, and this treasure was found, not very many years ago, by men digging deep on the hill where Troy once stood. The women too were given to the princes, and Neoptolemus took Andromache to his home in Argos, to draw water from the well and to be the slave of a master, and Agamemnon carried beautiful Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, to his palace in Mycenae, where they were both slain in one night. Only Helen was led with honor to the ship of Menelaus. The story of all that happened to Ulysses on his way home from Troy is told in another book, Tales of the Greek Seas. End of chapter 15. Recording by Maggie Travers in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. End of Tales of Troy, Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities, by Andrew Lang.